Alright guys, so this is the next video in the series for the GI, and one of the concepts that we'll kind of review on this one is the acid base, and it's pretty easy, and I think you can get the concepts down because it's definitely something you'll want to have for step one. So hope you like the video.
Alright guys, so here's the question. It says, a 50-year-old woman presents to her primary care physician complaining of prolonged episodes of watery diarrhea, fatigue, and muscle weakness. Laboratory results demonstrate that she is hypokalemic. No evidence of wheezing or heart murmur. And so we got two questions here. It says, what is the most likely mechanism of action of the patient's condition? So classic kind of a step one, not a lot of information up here, but you got to make a diagnosis, and then you have to associate something with that diagnosis. Now, when you look at the answer choices, secretion of vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, carcinoid syndrome, pellagra, ghrelin deficiency. So when you look back up the question and those answer choices, you kind of say, okay, they're trying to get at something. I know this can cause diarrhea. I know this can cause symptoms like that. I don't know so much about the pellagra or the ghrelin deficiency, but I know these two really can. So prolonged watery diarrhea, okay? And the reason I focus in on this one, because this was not only on my step one, but I think it was on my step three as well. But if you have prolonged episodes of watery diarrhea, she's 50, and there's no evidence of wheezing or heart murmur, kind of a key point there, what do you got to be thinking, okay? You got to be thinking a VIPoma, okay? A VIPoma. What is that? It's excess, it's basically, tumor, oma, where you're constant the secretion of vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, okay? But the key is, that's more than just memorizing this one, because when you see the prolonged episodes of water diarrhea, you say, well, look, that could also be the carcinoid syndrome, right? Because, this can also have, recurrent diarrhea, abdominal pain, abdominal, cramps, however they want to maybe say it. But the key with this one, and this is your take-home point, is that if it was carcinoid syndrome, there's usually some type of lung component they're going to give you on that one, right? Because there's like a tumor, typically, say the tumor has to be outside the GI system for it to cause these symptoms due to the whole first pass metabolism. So there's got to be some type of lung component. They could have asthma attacks. There's going to be something that's going to lead you back in that direction. And then they're going to have excess 5-HT or serotonin, okay? But associated with, and usually it's diastolic heart murmurs. So that's your big differential. So if you get someone that has prolonged watery diarrhea, and I know there's a lot of micro things that might do this, but just based on the answer choices, you kind of knew which direction they were going with this one, that you'll differentiate the VIPoma, which is secretion of vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, with carcinoid, because carcinoid is going to have the same thing, but you're going to get the heart murmur, and there's going to be some type of lung component involved. Now, pellagra, that is just deficiency of niacin. Wait a second, how does that come into play with any of this stuff? Well, actually, pellagra is associated with the carcinoid syndrome. Carcinoid syndrome, you have this excess serotonin, right? So what's the precursor to serotonin is tryptophan. Okay, right? Tryptophan can make serotonin. And so if all the tryptophan's going to make the serotonin, then you're not gonna have anything to make the niacin, okay? And then that's why you get the niacin deficiency, pellagra, which is associated with, in this situation, you get those symptoms associated with carcinoid syndrome due to that guy, okay? And then ghrelin deficiency, that's just it's a hormone, and that's associated with regulates hunger. Ghrelin regulates hunger. Okay, I think just associate those two, and you lose the ghrelin pretty much. When you have the a gastric bypass and such. So, but again, prolonged watery diarrhea, you got to make sure it's in your differential, the VIPoma. differentiate that with carcinoid when there's a heart issue, heart murmur, I should say, or lung issues. Which of the following is most associated with the patient's diagnosis? Well, we said it's a VIPoma, okay? And, with that, is it decrease in relaxation of intestinal smooth muscle and sphincters? Okay, so decrease in relaxation. So instead of relaxing, it would constrict up. Almost seems kind of opposite. Increase in GI motility producing migrating motor complexes. Well, that's actually the definition of motilin, right? And you see that, I think, in irritable bowel, IBS, okay? So not so much him, because that's the definition of motilin. Is it associated with Prader-Willi? Nope, never really heard of VIPoma associated with that by memory. But again, I put that in there because associated with Prader-Willi, remember that's like the kid, I believe it's the boy, who really weight gain. And so who is that going to be associated with? Ghrelin, okay, Ghrelin. Anyways, that's why I kind of stuck that in there. So of course it's not him with the VIPoma. Normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Well, maybe if I can eliminate this other one, I'd really like this one because unless I have that memorized. But again, if you're having a lot of watery diarrhea prolonged, it's not going to be a decrease in the relaxation because that's actually a tightening or a constriction of. It would actually be an increase if that was going to be the VIPoma. So it's not going to be A. The correct answer is going to be D. Now that takes us to the whole metabolic. How do you determine metabolic acidosis? But I said metabolic acidosis is associated with VIPoma. But they would probably give you some more information on this. But here's how you have to attack that. And really, all I want you to know is what the pH. pH is 7.4, and CO2 is going to be I think 40. I think the units is millimeters mercury. So this is kind of like dead center. This is, say, normal per se. To determine the 4 different types, right? You got respiratory acidosis. Okay, if I can ever write properly. You got metabolic acidosis. You got respiratory alkalosis. And then you got metabolic alkalosis, okay? And it's real easy. Now, I know there's this, that one way that a lot of people like to do it where they just say, well, if one goes up, if they both are headed in the same direction, then I think that's, God, what do we say that one is? Because I really didn't try to ever really remember it like that. But if they're both in the same direction, then it's metabolic. And if one goes in one direction and one goes in the other one, they're going to say it's respiratory. Okay, but I didn't really, and it works, but I tried to actually, learn the concept, because I'm always afraid on step 1 that if you don't understand the concept, they'll do something that's really going to mess you up. So if you think pH is 7.4 at neutral, and if it goes down, anything less than 7.4, I'm automatically going to jump on acidosis, right? No brainer. And then the next question that you ask yourself is you look at the CO2. You look at the CO2, okay? And if the CO2, I would say, look, if I got acidosis, and when I think of CO2, I think acid, okay? Like if I got a bunch of CO2, I'm acidic. If I got low CO2, I'm going alkaline. So then I say, well, if it's acid, if it's acidosis, is it explained by the CO2? Now, if the CO2 is elevated, right, because I have more CO2, then that would be boom, okay, it's respiratory, right? CO2 is respiratory. Because then I would say if I'm acidic here on the pH and my CO2 is elevated, I know it's acidosis number 1. Then I have to say, well, what is it? Is it metabolic or respiratory? I go right here on step number 2 and I look at the CO2, and if it's elevated, meaning I have more CO2, I say, boom, that's acidic. That's a cause of acidic. So it'd be respiratory acidosis. If it was low, okay, then I would say, oh, the lungs aren't the cause of this acidosis. It's got to be metabolic, okay? And so it's the same thing going back to the 2 ups or 1 up, 1 down. But I'd say take a little time and just understand the concept behind it. So with that being said, the anion gap per se is, how do you calculate that? The anion gap is going to be basically the sodium, okay, plus potassium and minus the chloride plus the bicarb. Now you say, well, who cares, right? Well, the reason that they're going to maybe test you on this is mainly for the metabolic acidosis. That's where the money's at. These other ones are real easy, you know, and making the diagnosis, which we'll do here in a second with questions, is real easy. It's understanding where these guys come from, but metabolic acidosis is where they take it and say, well, is it a metabolic acidosis with a normal anion gap or a high anion gap? Because that helps differentiate things. And then you got Winner's formula and stuff we'll talk about a different time. So anyways, back to this. The anion gap. The only time we care about that is when there's a metabolic acidosis for our simple terms. Okay? Now, when you add up all the cations and you subtract the anions, it should equal 0, right? But when they calculate all this stuff, there's a couple small players, because these are some relatively big numbers, right? I mean, 135 is big, 3 is not too big, chloride's usually around 106, bicarb 22. Some people get rid of the potassium because it's too small. But anyways, but there's some other stuff. There's some other stuff that are these anions that are not accounted for in this formula, and it's what this little box makes up determines whether it's a normal or a high anion gap, and that helps with the diagnosis. Okay, so this should always be normal, and it is. We just don't know what's in this box. So when we calculate this, and they would have to give you these numbers on the exam, but when you calculate sodium plus potassium minus the chloride and bicarb, you're either going to get a high anion gap or normal. Now, normal, I like to think of 10, they call it 10 milliequivalents per liter, okay, so 10. So after you do all these calculations, you should be around 10. If it's higher than that, you got to be thinking, you know, if it's a high ion gap, you got to be thinking, they say organic acids, and you're thinking lactate or lactic acid, i.e. aspirin. You're thinking keto acids, i.e. DKA, or you're thinking formic acid or methanol. Okay? So if it's a high anion gap, you're thinking those. If it's a normal anion gap, and this is your big take-home point, if it's a normal anion gap, you're thinking diarrhea or renal tubular acidosis. But in this situation, think diarrhea, right? Because what's really happening? In diarrhea, you're losing this guy, but what happens? The body makes up for it by giving more chloride, okay? And what happened in the VIPoma deal? In the VIPoma, what is it? It's just a watery diarrhea. So what's going to happen? It's going to have, it's going to be a metabolic acidosis. It's going to be a metabolic acidosis because it's diarrhea, and it's a normal. Why is it normal? Because despite us losing all the bicarb, what does the body do? What do the kidneys do? They give us, so bicarb went down, they give us more chloride. And it's because of that that this doesn't change, and it's a normal anion gap of 10. If it was something else the cause, this box would be much, much bigger and be a high anion gap. So again, when you get the diarrhea, think metabolic acidosis. It's going to be a normal anion gap. Sometimes they call that hyperchloremic. And why is that? Just like we said, because there's a ton of chloride ion. There's more. There's more than there usually is based on that. So anyways, that's kind of where you would go. Now, again, the only time I really care about that is if they give me a metabolic acidosis problem. Other than that, I don't care. At least for me on this exam for us. So when you think well, let's just go to the question so I don't lose you with too much information here. So this question reads, blood pH is 7.6, PaO2 72, PCO2 25, bicarb, blah 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 blah, and it says which of the following. This is one of the questions I gave some guys for an easy exam. So here's all the different scenarios. What do I care about? I know normal is 7.4 and 40. All right. So 7.4 and 40. What's my pH? 7.6. So what am I? What am I on this? Well, I know it's going to be an alkalosis. Okay, it's an alkalosis, right? Right? Because if it was less than 7.4, it's acid. If it's greater, it's an alkaline. Now, then I go to my PCO2. I got confused. It didn't make any sense. I go to my CO2 because I want to say bicarb. I go to my CO2 in my lungs and say, are my lungs responsible for causing this alkalosis? And I think, oh, if the CO2, for it to cause alkalosis, that means it's got to be getting rid of the CO2, so my CO2 should be low, and it is. It's 25, so that means my alkalosis is caused by the lungs, so it's a respiratory alkalosis. And again, you could have just went, okay, this one went up and this one went down. Opposite is respiratory, and there's the 7.6 is alkaline respiratory alkalosis. You could do that too. I'm just saying, either way works. Step one, just be aware it's a test of concepts. Now, with the metabolic acidosis, the one I always said, know that little mnemonic that you'll see in probably your first aid, the mud piles where it's methanol, uremia, diabetic ketoacidosis, paraldehyde, I know it's iron, lactic acidosis, ethylene glycol, and salicylates, like Tylenol, but Tylenol can be in another one as well. Metabolic alkalosis, okay, metabolic alkalosis, this is where you're going to, if you were vomiting, what are you going to throw up? You're going to throw up HCl, right? So this is going to be like vomiting can cause that. Diuretics, watch out for problems when they say someone with like anorexia, and has some type of compensation, and they're using diuretics. Make sure that if you see a metabolic alkalosis, and then respiratory acidosis. Think about that. What could cause something to where my breathing would slow down to where I'm retaining my CO2? I'm retaining it, right? And that causes an acidosis. So what would be a respiratory acidosis where there's, kind of like low breathing? Well, COPD can cause that. What about, your own pain meds, right? Pain meds too much, the respiratory suppression, opioids, that's kind of like the big one that's been around for a while. Anything that's going to cause, pulmonary edema, bronchitis, anything. I'm trying to think of some other severe asthma. They can all cause retention of the CO2. And then, of course, respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis, this is the one where it's caused by the lungs. Now, what would cause the CO2 to go away, go away, go away? Anxiety, right? Anxiety, high altitude, and things like that. Okay? All right. Now, last one. If my normal pH is 7.4, my normal CO2 is going to be 40, so it's 7.2, so it's acidic or acidosis, so I'm going to kind of keep an eye on those guys. Now, my CO2 is elevated, okay? So this guy went down, this guy went up. You got me even doing it this way. But if it's acidosis, I would ask myself, are the lungs creating this acidosis? Well, it went up, so I'm retaining more CO2, and I would say yes, they are. So again, either way, but understand the concept. This guy retained, if I get a high amount of him, it's acidotic. So these are the notes that I usually have on this. And I don't have these online, I don't think, because I don't think I ever laminated these. I just found these for one of my lectures. But it just kind of goes through the acid-base imbalances. long story short, it's the same thing that we did. Step 1, you look at the pH. Either it's acid or alkaline. Step 2, look at the CO2. You can either do the arrows up, arrows down, or just understand that the CO2 is the guy that's going to determine whether it's coming from the lungs or not the lungs. And really, again, the only time I want to do acid-base is for the metabolic acidosis. And then later on, we can talk about Winner's formula. These are just some examples, and then this is just some calculations of how you could do it. But back to the original question: VIPoma, diarrhea, metabolic acidosis. Okay? Hope this was helpful, guys.